The survey drone had been drifting over Aldous Reach for 6 hours before it found the sound. Perrin Dahl almost missed it. She was 3 shifts into a rotation that should have been routine, cataloguing a dead moon nobody expected to matter, and her console had been feeding her nothing but rock density readings and thermal noise. Then, buried under the static, a pattern repeated. Not a machine pattern. A voice pattern. Rising, falling, rising again, the same 11 notes over and over, like a child counting something out loud. She pulled her headset tighter and ran it through the translation matrix twice, certain the system had made an error. It hadn't. The signal was old, unlicensed, and coming from underneath the surface of a moon that every registry in Overeth space listed as uninhabited. Aldous Reach orbited the gas giant Threnna at the edge of surveyed space, a grey, cratered nothing that nobody had bothered to name for a purpose. It appeared in exactly one file that mattered, the abandonment ledger, a list of worlds where old colonization attempts had failed and gone quiet. Aldous Reach had been on that list for 190 years. Perrin sat very still and listened to the counting song loop a third time. Renlight, this is Dahl, she said, keeping her voice level the way her instructors had drilled into her. I have an audio anomaly on Aldous Reach. Requesting a hold on the survey timeline. The response took 90 seconds, long enough that she started composing the explanation she'd give if this turned out to be nothing, a stress fracture in the ice-releasing trapped gas, a fault in her own equipment, anything simpler than what her instincts were telling her. Copy, Dahl, said the Renlight's duty officer. Hold position. Command wants eyes before we log anything. Perrin adjusted the drone's sensors and pushed them deeper, past the surface ice, into a warren of tunnels her scans had already flagged as geologically unlikely, too straight, too regular, cut with intention rather than by heat and pressure. Warm air moved through them. Something down there was breathing. She thought about her father, a records archivist who had spent 40 years cataloguing extinct species and dead colonies, who used to tell her that the galaxy's oldest lie was the word empty. Nothing is ever truly empty, he'd said. It's just unvisited. The counting song looped again, closer this time, and underneath it, for half a second, she caught something else. Laughter. Real, unscripted, human laughter, echoing up through a heating vent that had no business existing on a world every chart called dead. Perrin sat back from her console and allowed herself 30 seconds of simple, unprofessional wonder before she flagged the discovery for command review, because whatever was living under Aldous Reach, it had been doing so for a very long time, entirely unnoticed. And it did not sound like it was suffering. It sounded like it was home. She pulled the moon's full survey history, while she waited for command to respond, and found exactly what she expected to find, which was almost nothing. A single automated pass logged 180 years earlier, flagging surface wreckage consistent with a failed colonization attempt, no signs of continued habitation, recommend abandonment listing. Nobody had ever gone back to check. Nobody, in 180 years, had thought a dead moon deserved a second look, because dead moons were common, and budgets for verifying them were not. Perrin found herself oddly angry about that, in a way she hadn't expected. Somewhere down in that rock, 2,000 or more people, by her rough estimate of the tunnel network scale, had spent nearly 2 centuries building an entire life that the wider galaxy had simply assumed didn't need checking on. She thought again of her father's line about the word empty, and wondered how many other worlds carried the same lazy assumption, waiting for someone curious enough, or simply bored enough on a routine survey shift, to actually listen. It sounded like it was home. 200 meters beneath the surface, Sailor Voss was teaching 17 children how to keep a name alive. The lesson happened every 10 days in the Hearth Hall, the largest of Aldous Reach's carved chambers, its ceiling strung with glow moss cultivated over 6 generations, until the whole cavern breathed a soft green light. The children sat in a loose circle on woven mats, and Sailor sat with them rather than above them, because that was the first rule of the naming circle her grandmother had taught her before she could walk. "Say it back to me," Sailor said, and the children chanted the counting song together, the same 11 notes Perrin had just heard bounce off a survey satellite 300 kilometers up. Most people who heard it assumed it was a nursery rhyme. It was not. Each note carried a name, a founder of the colony, sung in the order they had died during the first terrible winter after the crash, when the Meridian Promises hull had cracked open on final descent and buried half its survivors under stone before anyone had a chance to grieve properly. Someone in that first generation, some unremembered, exhausted parent, had turned mourning into music so the children could carry the dead without carrying the horror. Who was the third name? Sailor asked. A small boy named Tobin raised his hand immediately. Iris Amel. She fixed the water reclaimers with her own hands before the air got bad. Good, Sailor said. And why do we still say her name? Because if we stop saying it, the children answered together, the way they always did, she stops being anyone at all. It was, Sailor's grandmother used to say, the whole reason Aldous Reach had survived its first year, and every year since. Not the engineering. Not the geothermal taps, or the hydroponic caverns, or the ingenious water cycling that recycled every drop of moisture through 6 separate systems before it was allowed to be lost. The names. The insistence that every person mattered enough to be remembered out loud, and that insistence, over 190 years, had calcified into something larger. A way of deciding things together. A way of making sure nobody's voice simply evaporated into silence. They called it the naming circle, and it governed everything from water rationing to tunnel expansion, to who got first use of the medical bay's single working scanner. Any decision that touched more than one household required every affected voice to be gathered and heard before anything moved forward. It was slow when the colony was small. Nobody, back then, imagined it would ever need to be fast. After the lesson, Sailor climbed the long spiral stair to the surface observation blister, a reinforced dome her great-grandfather had built so someone could always watch the sky, in case the day ever came when someone watched back. She did this most evenings, less out of duty now than habit, and she looked out at Threnna's vast banded clouds the way her grandmother had taught her, waiting for nothing in particular. That evening, for the first time in 190 years, something was actually there. A thin, distant gleam, moving against the stars in a way no natural object moved. Sailor stood very still and felt something she hadn't expected to feel about a moment she had privately rehearsed her whole life. Not triumph. Not even hope, exactly. She felt afraid. The Renlight held station above Aldous Reach for 4 days before Command authorized contact, and in that time, Perrin learned more about restraint than she had in 6 years of survey training. She spent the first 2 of those days compiling everything the ship's archive held on pre-compact human colonization, a thinner file than she expected, mostly cautionary summaries written by administrators who had never met a living human and had no particular reason to update their assumptions. The recurring theme, across every document, was catastrophe. Colonies that failed violently, disappeared without explanation, or simply went silent, and were quietly reclassified as cautionary case studies rather than living concerns. Nowhere in the file did anyone seem to have considered the possibility that silence might simply mean survival without an audience. Everything we have on your species assumes the worst outcome, she admitted to Sailor, much later, once trust between them had grown enough to make the admission safe. I think that's why Command took 4 days to even authorize a hail. Nobody wanted to be the administrator, who worked something dangerous by mistake. And now? Sailor asked. Now I think the file just needs rewriting, Perrin said. Every instinct told her to send a hail immediately. Every regulation told her to wait for a full risk assessment, because first contact with an unregistered population, however small, carried protocols measured in weeks, not days. Her supervising officer, A weathered overeth named Administrator Reth Corvain made the final call to compress that timeline to something survivable, and even then he did it with visible unease. "You understand what you may be looking at," Corvain said to her in the observation deck, feathers along his crest laid flat in the particular way Overeth showed concentration rather than calm. "Every record we have of pre-compact human colonization ends the same way. Catastrophic failure. Total loss of contact. If there is a population down there, Dahl, it has had 190 years to become something we have no model for. Or it's had 190 years to become exactly what it was," Perrin said, "just older." Corvain looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that meant he was deciding whether her optimism was an asset or a liability, and said nothing else before authorizing the hail. The voice that answered surprised them both. It was not fearful. It was not hostile. It was a woman, careful and steady, introducing herself as Sailor Voss, first voice of the Aldous Reach naming circle, a title that meant nothing to the Renlight's translation matrix, and took an embarrassing 11 seconds to render into something Corvain could parse as roughly equivalent to elected spokesperson. "We saw your ship 4 days ago," Sailor said, once the connection stabilized enough for real conversation. "We've been discussing what to say to you ever since." "Discussing," Corvain repeated. "The entire time." "Everyone who wanted to speak got to speak," Sailor said, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "It took a while. We are 2,300 people, and most of us had an opinion." Perrin, watching from the secondary console, felt something shift in her chest at that number. 2,300 people, thriving, organized, entirely unassisted, in tunnels that official records insisted held nothing but rock and old debris. Corvain requested permission to send a small survey team to the surface, and Sailor agreed on one condition, that the team meet with a full session of the naming circle before touching anything below ground. Corvain bristled slightly at being told the terms of his own first contact mission, but he agreed, mostly, Perrin suspected, out of sheer curiosity about what a full session of 2,000 people actually looked like. She found out 3 days later, and it changed the shape of everything she thought she understood about what a small, isolated population could accomplish. Underscore 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 underscore. The Hearth Hall had never held every adult in the colony at once before. Sailor had feared, privately, that it wouldn't. But when word went out that the Sky Strangers wanted to speak with the Circle directly, people came from every terrace and tunnel until the great cavern was packed shoulder to shoulder, glow moss light falling across thousands of upturned faces. And Sailor stood at the center of it feeling smaller than she had in years. Perrin Dahl stood beside Corvain near the entrance, and Sailor watched her carefully, the way she watched every stranger, for the particular kind of unease that meant someone was calculating a threat rather than meeting a people. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something closer to naked astonishment. "You built all this," Perrin said quietly, mostly to herself, looking up at the terrace dwellings carved into the cavern walls, the water channels, the hanging gardens fed by engineered light. "Our ancestors built the frame," Sailor said. "We've spent 190 years finishing it." Corvain, formal and careful, delivered the Assembly's standard first contact address, an explanation of the compact, an offer of provisional goodwill, a request for basic information about the colony's needs and intentions. It was the kind of speech Sailor suspected he'd delivered, or trained to deliver, a dozen times before, to species who had never known anything but silence between the stars. When he finished, Sailor did something that visibly unsettled him. She turned to the crowd instead of answering herself. "You heard the administrator," she called out, her voice carrying easily through the cavern's natural acoustics. Every household, name your questions. What followed took most of an hour, and Perrin watched it with an expression Sailor would later come to recognize as the specific look of someone watching their entire model of a society quietly come apart and reassemble into something more interesting. Farmers asked about trade. Parents asked about safety for their children. An old man near the back asked, bluntly, whether the sky strangers intended to take the moon from them, and the crowd went very quiet waiting for Sailor's answer. I don't know yet, Sailor said honestly, and there was something in her voice that told the crowd she meant it, that she wasn't hiding a private certainty behind diplomatic caution. But we'll decide what to do about it together, the same way we always have. A young mother near the front asked whether the Sky Stranger's ship carried anything that could help with the recurring lung infections that struck children born in the lower terraces, where the air ran thinner and colder than anywhere else in the colony. Corvain, caught slightly off guard by the specificity of the question, promised to have the Renlight's medical officer review the colony's records, and the crowd's murmured approval at that answer told Perrin more about what mattered to these people than any formal briefing could have. An old farmer near the water channels asked, with visible suspicion, whether accepting help from outsiders meant owing something in return, a debt neither he nor his children would understand the terms of until it was too late to refuse. Sailor answered that one herself, directly, without softening it. Nothing gets accepted on behalf of this colony without the circle agreeing to the terms first, she said. That's not changing today, and it's not changing because a ship showed up in the sky. If anyone here doesn't trust that promise, say so now, and we'll talk it through until you do. Nobody said so. The old farmer nodded, apparently satisfied, and the questions continued. Corvain, watching this unfold, leaned toward Perrin and murmured, "This is not a hierarchy." "No," Perrin said. "I don't think it is." "Then who is actually in charge?" Perrin watched Sailor field a dozen more questions, deferring, clarifying, occasionally letting the crowd's own murmured consensus settle an answer before she spoke it back to them, and she felt the beginnings of an idea she wasn't yet ready to say out loud. "I think," she said slowly, "everyone is." Corvain did not look reassured by this. He looked, for the first time since Perrin had met him, genuinely uncertain what he was dealing with, and 3 months later, that uncertainty would matter far more than either of them could have guessed on that ordinary, crowded evening in the Hearth Hall. The provisional goodwill lasted 11 weeks, long enough for the Renlight's science team to catalogue Aldous Reach's tunnels in exhaustive, admiring detail, and long enough for Perrin Dahl to become something the colony hadn't expected to need. A translator, not of language, but of expectation. She spent her days moving between the survey team's careful protocols and the circle's looser, faster rhythms, explaining each to the other, smoothing friction that arose not from malice, but from two societies that had simply never had to learn each other's grammar of trust. She ate meals in the Hearth Hall more often than aboard the Renlight. She learned the names of the founders from the counting song, all 11 of them, and found herself humming it without meaning to during long survey shifts. "You've gone native," Corvain told her once, not entirely as a joke. "I've gone curious," Perrin said. "There's a difference." She learned, too, the smaller textures of life in the tunnels, the way the colony marked its days not by a clock, but by the slow cycling of the glow moss lighting, brighter during work hours, dim to a soft amber during rest. An entire population's circadian rhythm quietly engineered by their own ancestors out of nothing but patience and cultivated fungus. She learned that the hydroponic terraces produced a tart, orange-fleshed fruit unique to Aldous Reach, grown from seed stock salvaged out of the Meridian Promises' original cargo manifest and painstakingly cross-bred over 6 generations, until it could thrive on reclaimed water and filtered light. She ate one for the first time sitting beside Sailor on the observation blister's narrow bench, and found it sharper and sweeter than anything she'd tasted aboard the Renlight in years. "You could sell this," Perrin said, only half joking. "There isn't anything like it in compact markets." "We've never needed to sell anything," Sailor said. "We've only ever needed enough. It was during those 11 weeks that Sailor showed her the archive room, a modest chamber near the colony's original crash site, where the Meridian Promise's surviving logs were kept, brittle data slates preserved under carefully regulated humidity, tended by a rotating line of keepers stretching back 6 generations. Nobody outside the circle has seen these, Sailor said, handing Perrin a slate with visible reluctance. But I think you'll understand what happened here better if you read the Founder's own words instead of hearing them secondhand. The slate held the final entries of Captain Iris Amel, the colony's first leader, written in the exhausted, unpolished hand of someone documenting a catastrophe in real time rather than composing history for later readers. The Meridian Promise had suffered a drive failure during an ordinary relocation flight, nothing dramatic, nothing worthy of legend, just an aging component failing at the worst possible moment, forcing an emergency descent that killed 40% of the colonists on impact and left the survivors buried under collapsing terrain with dwindling supplies and no working long-range communication. Amel's last entry, written the night the 11th Founder died, read simply, "We cannot afford to lose anyone twice. If we cannot save their lives, we will at least save their names. Every voice we still have gets heard before we decide anything. That is the only law I am leaving behind." Perrin read it twice, then looked up at Sailor. This is where the circle came from. It wasn't a philosophy. It was triage. Grief, mostly, Sailor said. My grandmother used to say the circle wasn't built because we were wise. It was built because we were desperate, and desperate people either turn on each other or hold each other up, and Iris Amel decided, out loud, in front of everyone, which one we were going to be. Perrin set the slate down carefully, aware suddenly of the weight of what she was holding, not just data, but the origin of a governing instinct that had somehow, across nearly 2 centuries, produced a civilization capable of assembling 2,300 opinions into a single evening's decision. Administrator Corvain thinks your speed is a curiosity, Perrin said slowly. I don't think he understands yet what it actually is. What is it, then? Perrin considered the question longer than Sailor expected. A weapon nobody built on purpose, she said finally. The fastest consensus mechanism I've ever seen, and it came from the worst night in your history. Sailor didn't answer that directly. Instead she carefully returned the slate to its housing and said, I hope we never have to find out if you're right. They sat together for a while after that, neither in a hurry to leave the small archive room, and Sailor found herself asking questions she hadn't planned to ask, about the Overeth homeworld, about whether Perrin's own people had anything like the counting song, some ritual for holding the dead close enough to still matter. We have registries, Perrin admitted. Names filed and searchable, technically permanent. But nobody sings them. I don't think anyone's opened most of those files in generations. That sounds lonely, Sailor said, without any edge of judgment in it. I used to think it sounded efficient, Perrin said. I'm not sure anymore that those are different things. Sailor laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, and for a moment the two of them were simply two people sitting in lamplight, comparing what their separate worlds had decided was worth remembering. It was the kind of evening that would have meant nothing to a tribunal report and everything to the two women who lived it, and Sailor would think of it often in the harder weeks that followed, a reminder that whatever came next, it had started, at least once, as something gentle. Neither of them knew yet how soon that gentleness would be tested. The Kethril Concern's survey ship arrived without warning on the 82nd day of contact, a blunt, utilitarian vessel called the Ninth Ledger, and its arrival changed the tenor of everything within hours. Administrator Josselarian, the Concern's regional claims officer, did not request a circle session. He did not, in fact, request anything from Sailor Voss at all. He addressed his first communication directly to Corvain, citing an obscure, but entirely legitimate clause of compact resource law, the lapsed habitation statute, which held that any world listed on the official abandonment ledger for more than 150 years reverted automatically to unclaimed resource status unless a sovereign registration was filed and verified before the anniversary date. Aldous Reach's abandonment listing was 191 years old. No sovereign registration had ever been filed, because no one outside the tunnels had known there was anyone left to file one. The moon is, by every legal measure currently in force, an unclaimed asset, Ilarion said, his voice carrying the particular calm of someone who had delivered unwelcome news so many times it no longer registered to him as unwelcome. The concern holds valid extraction rights pending a 90-day habitation review. I'm sure this is a formality that resolves in the colony's favor. I am equally sure you understand why we can't simply take a verbal assurance as legal fact. Corvain, to his credit, pushed back immediately, citing the 11 weeks of provisional goodwill, the ongoing first contact protocols, the sheer inhumanity of treating a living population as a resource lapse. Ilarion listened to all of it with polite, unmoved patience. I don't dispute that people live there, Administrator, he said. I dispute that the law currently recognizes them as a sovereign body rather than an unregistered population occupying concern-claimed territory. Those are different questions, and only one of them is mine to answer. Fix the paperwork, and this entire conversation becomes irrelevant. The paperwork, as it turned out, required something the Circle had never once needed to produce: a single unified, verifiable declaration of continuous self-governance, backed by a level of documented consensus the Compact's legal system would accept as binding. Aldous Reach had never needed to prove it governed itself. It simply did, quietly, for 190 years, with no outside audience to convince. Corvain, still working the problem from his own end, requested a private channel with Ilarion once the initial exchange ended, hoping a conversation between administrators might soften what had just been delivered to a civilian population with no warning. I'm not asking you to abandon a legitimate claim, Corvain said. I'm asking you to remember there are children down there who've never known any home but that one. I do remember it, Administrator, Ilarion said, and something in his tone suggested he meant it, or at least believed he did. I've filed claims on 11 worlds this decade. 4 of them had populations on record. This is not a decision I make lightly. It's simply one the law makes for me, unless someone can show me otherwise in time. And if no one can, then the law does what it was written to do, Ilarion said. I don't take pleasure in that, Administrator. I just don't get to pretend it isn't true. Corvain relayed the exchange to Sailor almost word for word, and she listened without visible reaction, the way she'd learned to listen to bad news since she was young enough to be taught the counting song for the first time. He's not cruel, she said finally. That might be worse. Cruelty we could at least argue with. Sailor received the news from Perrin directly, in the archive room, both of them staring at the same slate that held Iris Amel's last words. How long do we have? Sailor asked. 90 days, officially, Perrin said. But Ilarion's already filed a request to accelerate review, citing operational costs of holding an idle extraction crew in orbit. If the tribunal grants it, that 90 days could become considerably less. Sailor absorbed this in silence for a long moment, then did something Perrin hadn't expected. She smiled, faintly, and reached for a fresh data slate. Then we start tonight, Sailor said. Every household. Every voice. We've never had to write ourselves down before. We'll see how fast we actually are. Word of the 90-day deadline reached the tunnels within the hour, carried the same way every hard piece of news had ever traveled through Aldous Reach, mouth to mouth, terrace to terrace, faster than any official notice could have managed. Sailor expected panic. What she found instead, walking the corridors that evening, was something closer to a held breath, people pausing their ordinary tasks to ask quiet, practical questions. What do they need from us? When do we start? Who's keeping the record this time? An elderly keeper named Ozen Ma, who had tended the archive slates for 30 years before passing the duty to Sailor's own mother, found her in the main corridor, and pressed a worn data stylus into her hand without a word, an old habit from a life spent recording things that mattered before anyone told her they would. "We've done hard counts before," Ozan said. "Not this hard. But we've done them." It was, Perrin realized later, the first quiet decision that would matter more than either of them understood at the time, a choice made calmly, almost casually, in a small archive room, that would end up determining whether 2,300 people got to keep the only home they had ever known. The accelerated review was granted 11 days later, and with it came Joscelarian's revised timeline, delivered without apology, and without the polite patience of their first exchange. "The tribunal has authorized preliminary extraction surveys to begin immediately," Ilarion informed Corvain, copying Sailor into the transmission, as what he called a professional courtesy. "Should the habitation registration fail to be verified and filed by the review deadline, standard evacuation procedures for unregistered occupants will apply. I want to stress that the concern has no wish to see anyone harmed. We simply cannot hold operational assets idle indefinitely waiting on a filing that may never come." The 9th Ledger's survey crews began landing heavy equipment on the surface within a day, drilling rigs and thermal mapping arrays that Sailor's engineers recognized immediately as strip extraction hardware, the kind used to hollow a moon's crust for minerals with no particular concern for what already lived beneath it. "They are not waiting for the review to fail," Sailor said, watching the equipment deployment feeds from the observation blister with Perrin beside her. "They are preparing to start the moment it does." "That's not unusual for the concern," Perrin admitted, and hated how thin the admission sounded even as she said it. "They stage equipment early on every claim to minimize downtime. It doesn't mean the outcome's decided. Doesn't it?" Perrin didn't have an answer for that. Down in the lower terraces, the sound of the drilling rigs reached the colony before any official notice did, a low, patient grinding that traveled through the rock itself, felt in the soles of the feet before it was ever heard by the ear. Children stopped their games to listen to it. Old men who remembered stories of the crash, told to them by parents who remembered it firsthand, went quiet in a way that worried their families more than any argument could have. Tobin, the boy from Sailor's counting lesson, found her in the main corridor 2 days after the equipment arrived and asked her, with the blunt honesty only children seem to manage, whether the Sky People were going to take the ceiling away. "No one's taking anything away tonight," Sailor told him, crouching down to his level the way she had been taught to answer hard questions, with truth sized to fit the person asking it. "But we might have to work very hard soon to make sure that stays true. Would you help if I asked you to?" "With what?" "Remembering things. Telling people what you remember. That's a job too, you know. It always has been." Tobin considered this with the gravity of a much older person and nodded, satisfied, and went back to his game, and Sailor stood in the corridor a moment longer, listening to the drilling rigs hum through the stone, and let herself feel, just for a moment, exactly how frightened she was before she went back to being the person the colony needed her to be. The colony's response to the threat revealed something Perrin hadn't yet seen in 11 weeks of living among them. Fear, when it came, didn't fracture the circle the way she half expected it might. It sharpened it. Households that had spent years debating minor water allocations with patient, unhurried thoroughness suddenly found themselves capable of resolving entire questions in a single sitting, because the stakes had become, for the first time in generations, existential enough to focus every voice on the same target. Sailor organized a standing nightly session in the Hearth Hall, open to anyone, dedicated entirely to building the registration the tribunal required. Farmers who had never spoken publicly before stood and gave testimony about how long their family lines had worked the hydroponic terraces. Elderly keepers recited full lineages of every household back to the crash. Children, coached gently by their parents, recorded their own names into the growing document, a living census assembled not by administrators, but by the population itself, speaking for itself, in its own words. Perrin attended every session she could, partly out of genuine fascination, partly because she had started, quietly, to feel a loyalty she wasn't supposed to feel toward a population she was meant to be observing rather than defending. "You're documenting this like it's evidence," Corvain observed one evening, watching her compile her own independent record of the sessions. "It is evidence," Perrin said. "If Ilarion tries to claim this population can't produce verified consensus fast enough to matter, I want a record showing exactly how fast they actually are." Corvain studied her for a long moment. "You understand that submitting unauthorized evidence to a tribunal review could end your career." "I understand that 190 years of these people existing quietly and honestly is about to be erased by a filing deadline," Perrin said. "I can live with the career risk better than I could live with that." Corvain didn't argue further, though Perrin noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he stopped discouraging her either. He was, she suspected, fighting a quieter version of the same argument inside himself, caught between the careful neutrality his position demanded and the plain evidence of what he was watching unfold beneath his own survey deck. One evening, reviewing the Circle's nightly testimony feed alongside her, he said something Perrin hadn't expected from him. "When I was young," Corvain said, "my instructors taught us that civilizations without central authority eventually fracture under pressure. Too many voices, not enough discipline. I've spent my whole career assuming that was simply a law of nature, the way gravity is a law of nature." He gestured at the feed, at household after household adding testimony in careful, unhurried order despite the deadline pressing down on all of them. "This isn't fracturing, Dahl. If anything, it's the opposite." "Maybe it was never a law," Perrin said. "Maybe it was just something nobody had tested properly." Corvain didn't answer that, but he didn't disagree either, and Perrin filed the exchange away as one more small crack in the careful, cautious worldview she had arrived with, a worldview that was slowly, quietly, coming apart under the weight of 2,300 ordinary people simply being exactly who they had always been. The registration, when it was finally compiled, was staggering in its completeness. A document containing verified testimony from every one of Aldous Reach's 2,300 residents, cross-referenced against the original Meridian Promise Manifest, assembled in a fraction of the time any compact administrative body would have required for a population a tenth the size. Ilarion, reviewing the submission from aboard the Ninth Ledger, took 4 days to respond, and when he did, his tone had shifted in a way that unsettled Sailor more than open hostility would have. "This is an impressively thorough document," he said, and meant it, which was somehow worse. "I want to be direct with you, First Voice Voss. The completeness of your registration is not in question. Its legal sufficiency is." The technicality he cited was buried in a clause neither Sailor nor Perrin had anticipated, a requirement that sovereign registrations for populations exceeding a certain size include verified infrastructure sustainability projections, essentially proof that the colony could continue supporting itself independently for a further century without requiring assistance the concern might otherwise be obligated to provide. "You've built something remarkable down there," Ilarion said, and for a moment Sailor almost believed he meant it as more than a formality. "But sustainability projections require specialized modeling the concern's own engineers would normally supply for a claim of this scale. I don't believe your colony currently has that capability in-house." It was, Sailor realized with cold clarity, a door deliberately left just narrow enough that only the concern could walk through it. The Circle could produce testimony. It could not, on its own, produce the kind of specialized engineering projection Ilarion was now demanding, and offering to supply it himself, on a schedule entirely of his own choosing. That night's Circle session was the tensest Sailor had ever led. 2,000 voices, exhausted from days of testimony, now facing a demand that felt engineered specifically to exceed what any of them could deliver in time. The room absorbed the news the way it absorbed everything hard, in silence first, then in a low murmur that spread outward from the front rows toward the back, not panic, but a kind of collective bracing, thousands of shoulders squaring at once. A woman near the water channel stood without being asked and said simply, "Then we learn what we need to learn. We've done it before." A ripple of agreement followed her, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of a population deciding, without any formal vote, that despair was not going to be the thing they chose tonight. It was Perrin, standing quietly near the back of the hearth hall, who spoke up. "I can build that model," she said, and the cavern went silent enough that her voice carried without effort. "I trained in resource sustainability modeling before I transferred to survey work. It's not concern-exclusive knowledge. It's just knowledge they'd prefer you didn't have independent access to." Corvain, present that evening for the first time in weeks, looked at her sharply. "Dahl, if you build that model outside official channels, you compromise your neutrality as a compact observer." "I stopped being neutral 11 weeks ago, Sir," Perrin said. "I just hadn't said it out loud yet." The following 72 hours became, in Sailor's later retelling, the moment she finally understood what Perrin had meant by a weapon nobody built on purpose. Perrin worked alongside Aldous Reach's own engineers, people who had spent generations maintaining geothermal taps and water reclaimers with almost no outside resources, and discovered, to her genuine astonishment, that their practical engineering knowledge exceeded anything she'd learned in formal training. They didn't need her expertise so much as her vocabulary, the specific technical language the tribunal's review process required. Together they produced a sustainability projection more rigorous than anything the concern typically supplied for claims a fraction of Aldous Reach size, verified not by a single specialist, but by the collective, tested knowledge of an entire population that had been quietly solving these exact problems for 190 years. The work itself surprised Perrin more than she expected it to. She had come to Aldous Reach trained to think of engineering knowledge as something credentialed, held by specialists, verified through formal channels before it could be trusted. What she found instead, working alongside a water reclamation supervisor named Desh Coram, and a geothermal technician, who introduced herself only as Nan, was a body of practical expertise passed down so thoroughly through 6 generations, that it had never needed a formal name to be reliable. "You keep asking us for our credentials," Nan told her, halfway through their second night of modeling, not unkindly. "We don't have degrees. We have grandmothers who taught us which valve fails first when the pressure runs high, and why, and what to do about it before it becomes a real problem. That's not less than a degree. It's just older." Perrin spent that night translating 190 years of grandmother's knowledge into the specific technical language a tribunal would recognize, and found, by the time the projection was finished, that she had learned considerably more from Nan than Nan had learned from her. When Ilarion received it, his response took considerably longer than 4 days. The silence from the 9th ledger lasted a week, and Sailor spent every day of it certain it meant something had gone badly wrong. She was right, though not in the way she expected. Ilarion's revised response arrived not as a rejection, but as a procedural escalation, a request to the compact tribunal to disqualify the sustainability projection entirely on the grounds that it had been produced with the assistance of a compact survey officer acting outside her authorized scope, rendering the document, in his words, an improperly influenced submission requiring independent re-verification before any registration can be considered valid. The re-verification process, conveniently, would take considerably longer than the colony's remaining window before the extraction deadline. Effectively, disqualifying the model didn't just delay the registration. It killed it, quietly, through procedure rather than confrontation. Worse followed within hours. Administrator Corvain received formal notice that Officer Perrin Dahl was being recalled from Aldous Reach pending an ethics review of her conduct, effective immediately, and reassigned to the Renlight's secondary systems until the review concluded. "I'm sorry," Perrin told Sailor, the last time they spoke before Corvain's shuttle came to collect her. "I should have expected this. I gave them exactly the excuse they needed." "You gave 2,300 people a projection they couldn't have built alone in time," Sailor said. "That's not something to apologize for." "It's something that might not matter now," Perrin said, and for the first time since Sailor had known her, she looked genuinely uncertain what came next. They stood together in the observation blister a while longer, watching the shuttle lights approach across the grey surface, neither of them quite ready to fill the silence with something as small as a plan. "When you get back up there," Sailor said finally, "and they ask you whether we are a threat or a miracle, the way your Captain Vale's report once framed it for another crew a long time ago, I imagine you'll have your own answer by now." Perrin looked at her, surprised. "You know that history?" "I read everything your people have ever let us see about first contact," Sailor said. "It seemed important to understand what we might be walking into." "We are neither," Perrin said slowly. "I don't think you're a threat, and I don't think what you built here was a miracle either. I think it was just work. 190 years of work, done honestly, by people who never had the luxury of doing it any other way." Sailor nodded, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't have sounded smaller than the truth already sitting between them. The Ninth Ledger's extraction rigs, which had been idling on the surface for weeks, received activation orders the following morning. Ilarian's transmission was brief, almost gentle in its delivery, which somehow made it worse. "The tribunal has granted our disqualification request," he said. "Your registration currently has no valid sustainability component on file. Standard procedure requires immediate evacuation of the claim site pending resolution. I've been authorized to compress the evacuation window to 6 hours, given the operational costs already incurred. I'm sorry it's come to this." First voice Voss. "I hope you understand this isn't personal. 6 hours. Not 90 days. Not even the original deadline. 6 hours to empty tunnels that had taken 6 generations to build, or watch strip extraction equipment begin tearing through ground that held homes, gardens, water systems, and the resting places of everyone the counting song had ever named." She thought, standing there, of every argument the circle had ever settled over the years: water rations during a dry season, a dispute over which family got first claim to a newly carved terrace, the small, patient work of making sure nobody's voice simply got lost in the noise of a larger decision. None of it had ever been urgent in the way this was urgent. None of it had ever carried the weight of an entire population's continued existence riding on how fast 2,300 people could be honestly heard. She thought too of Tobin, 7 years old, asking her plainly whether the ceiling was going to be taken away, and of the promise she'd made him without fully knowing, at the time, how close that promise might come to being broken. Sailor stood alone in the observation blister after the transmission ended, looking out at the same stars she'd watched her whole life, and felt something close over in her chest that was not quite despair, because despair would have meant giving up, and she had absolutely no intention of doing that. She thought of Iris Amel's last written words. "We cannot afford to lose anyone twice." Then she went to call the largest circle session Aldous Reach had ever held, with less time to gather it than any decision in the colony's history had ever allowed. Word moved through Aldous Reach's tunnels faster than any transmission the Ninth Ledger could have anticipated, not through official channels, because there had never been official channels, but through the same structure that had carried news for 190 years. Neighbor to neighbor. Household to household. Every person who heard the 6-hour deadline immediately became responsible for telling the next. Sailor didn't call for silence when the hearth hall filled to capacity within 40 minutes, faster than any gathering in the colony's recorded history. She simply stood at the center of the crowd, the way her grandmother had taught her, and let the cavern's own noise settle into listening on its own terms. "You all know what they are asking," she said. 6 hours to leave everything we've built, based on a technicality nobody here created and nobody here can argue against in a courtroom none of us have ever seen. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I know how to beat that in a courtroom. I don't." She let that admission sit in the cavern for a moment before continuing. "But I know how to do the one thing that room full of lawyers can't do in 6 hours. I know how to ask every single person in this colony what they want to happen next, and I know we can answer that question faster than anyone up there thinks is possible. That's not a courtroom trick. That's just who we've always been. What followed was not a vote in the way the compact would have recognized one. It was something closer to the oldest instinct the colony possessed, activated at full scale for the first time in its history. Every household sent a voice into the hearth hall, or into one of the 6 overflow chambers linked by comm relay, and each voice was recorded, weighed, and folded into a single, growing declaration, not of grievance, but of fact. We are here. We have always been here. We have governed ourselves honestly for 190 years, and we do not intend to stop now, because a filing deadline says we were never counted. An elderly woman named Vesa Okonkwo Reyes, 91 years old and one of the last people alive who remembered stories of the crash secondhand from her own grandmother, stood in the 3rd overflow chamber, and gave testimony that took less than 2 minutes, but silenced the room around her. She spoke of the first winter, of names sung instead of buried, of 190 years spent turning grief into something that could hold weight instead of simply hollowing everyone out. When she finished, she said only one more thing. Write down that I said this counts. Write down that I was here. Tobin, 7 years old and utterly unaware of the historical weight of what he was participating in, gave his own testimony a few minutes later, coached gently by his mother, stating his name, his household, and his favorite thing about living in the tunnels, which turned out to be the sound the water made in the Eastern Channel at night. It was, on its own, a small and unremarkable thing to say. Folded into 2,299 other testimonies, it became something else entirely, proof, undeniable and granular, that an entire population had chosen, freely and in its own words, to keep existing exactly where it had always existed. Sailor's own engineers, working alongside the record keepers, compiled testimony in real time, cross-referencing it against Iris Amel's original founding log, against 6 generations of circle minutes, against every water allocation and tunnel expansion argument the colony had ever settled together. It was, in effect, the sustainability projection Alarian had disqualified, rebuilt from scratch by the population itself, in language no tribunal technicality could dismiss, as improperly influenced, because no single outside voice had touched it. In the 2nd overflow chamber, a group of teenagers, who had grown up hearing the counting song their whole lives without fully understanding its weight, took it upon themselves to organize the youngest children into a simple relay system, running testimony slates between households too far from any chamber to reach in time, turning what could have been a logistical bottleneck into one more thread in the larger effort. Nobody had assigned them that task. They had simply looked at what needed doing and done it, the same instinct that had kept the water reclaimers running for 6 generations, without anyone writing a formal job description for the work. Sailor moved between chambers as the hours passed, checking in, answering questions, occasionally correcting a testimony that had drifted from fact into grievance, gently reminding each speaker that the declaration needed to stand as truth first and argument second, because truth was the one thing Alarian's tribunal couldn't disqualify on a technicality. By the 3rd hour, she had stopped needing to correct anyone. The colony had found its own rhythm, the same rhythm it had used to ration water and settle tunnel disputes for nearly 2 centuries, simply turned up to a scale nobody had ever asked of it before. 4 hours in, with 2 hours remaining before the extraction rigs were authorized to begin, Aldous Reach produced a declaration of continuous sovereign governance verified by every living resident, the fastest full population consensus document ever generated in compact history, though none of them knew that statistic yet. They only knew they had done, in 4 hours, what Alarian had bet his entire timeline on them being unable to do in 6. Aboard the Wren Light, Perrin Dahl watched the data stream arrive through a channel she technically wasn't authorized to monitor anymore, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in days. Corvain, she said, not bothering with rank formality, you need to see this. Corvain reviewed the declaration in silence, feathers along his crest rising slightly, the Overeth expression Perrin had learned meant something between astonishment and alarm. This was compiled in 4 hours, he said slowly. 2,300 people, Perrin said. Every one of them accounted for, verified, cross-referenced against records older than most compact archives. "Sir, if this doesn't qualify as legally sufficient, I don't know what would." Corvain didn't answer immediately. He was already composing an emergency transmission to the tribunal, one that would, 3 weeks later, be cited in updated compact procedure, as the first formally recognized instance of a population's own governing structure standing as sufficient legal evidence of sovereignty, without need for outside verification. But that recognition was still hours away, and on the surface of Aldous Reach, the Ninth Ledger's extraction rigs were already powering up, their operators unaware, or perhaps simply unwilling to check, that the 6-hour deadline had just run out from underneath them. Jos Ilarion received the declaration with 11 minutes left on his own clock, and to his credit, he read it in full before deciding what to do next. Ilarion stood on the Ninth Ledger's bridge, watching his extraction crews complete their final pre-drill checks, the declaration open on a secondary display he had not yet acknowledged aloud. His claims adjutant, a younger Overeth named Cyril Bain, broke the silence first. "Sir, the tribunal liaison is requesting an emergency hold on drill authorization pending review of a new submission." "I've seen it," Ilarion said. "Do we hold?" Ilarion read the declaration a second time, slower, noting the timestamp on its final compiled entry, 4 hours and 11 minutes after the deadline had been issued, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in a career built almost entirely on the predictable slowness of institutions. Genuine unease. He had built his entire timeline around a simple, reasonable assumption that no population, however organized, could produce a legally rigorous, individually verified consensus document covering more than 2,000 people inside 6 hours. It was not an unreasonable assumption. It matched every precedent the Compact had ever generated. It simply happened to be wrong, because Aldous Reach had spent 190 years training for exactly this moment without ever knowing it was training at all. "Hold the drills," Ilarion said quietly. "Sir?" "I said hold the drills, Bain. I'm not in the business of grinding a fully verified sovereign population into, or because our paperwork moved slower than theirs did." He paused, looking again at the declaration's final line, a closing statement Sailor had insisted on including herself. "We are not an asset waiting to be counted. We are the ones who never stopped counting." "Draft a formal notice to the tribunal," Ilarion said. "Extraction operations on Aldous Reach are suspended pending full sovereignty review. And Bain, find out how in the Compact's name 2,000 people did that in 4 hours. I want to understand what we just ran into." He would spend, over the following months, a considerable amount of professional effort trying to answer that exact question, and would eventually conclude, in a report that became mildly infamous among Compact resource administrators, that the concern's entire claims model had been built on an assumption that consensus scaled slowly with population size. Aldous Reach had simply never learned that assumption applied to them. Bain, reading over his shoulder as he drafted the suspension notice, asked the question more bluntly than protocol usually allowed between an adjutant and a claims officer. "Sir, are we going to lose the appeal? If this holds up, we've spent a fair amount of the concern's capital getting nothing back." "We were never entitled to a return on an assumption," Bain, Ilarion said. "We were entitled to a fair claims process. This is what a fair claims process looks like when it runs into something it wasn't built to anticipate. I'd rather absorb the cost than be the administrator who mined through 2,300 verified lives because the paperwork moved slower than the people did." It was not, Bain would later admit to colleagues, the answer he expected from a man whose entire career had been built on the quiet arithmetic of resource extraction, but it was, in its own way, the moment several younger claims officers aboard the Ninth Ledger would point to years later as the beginning of a broader, slower change in how the concern approached lapsed habitation claims across the whole sector. Before drafting the formal notice, Ilarion did something none of his staff expected of him. He requested surface clearance to walk, briefly and alone, along the ridge above the tunnel network his rigs had been prepared to open, close enough to hear faintly, through his suit's external pickup, the low murmur of the counting song still drifting up through a distant heating vent, the same sound that had first crossed Perendal's console months earlier. He stood there longer than his schedule strictly allowed, watching Threnna's banded clouds turn slowly overhead, and thought about the 11 worlds he'd claimed over the past decade, and the 4 that had carried populations on record, populations that had been resettled, compensated, filed away as line items in a resolved claim. He had always told himself that was fair. Standing above Aldous Reach, listening to a song 2,300 people had just used to save their own home in 4 hours, he found the word fair sitting less comfortably than it once had. Sailor received word of the suspended drills 40 minutes after the deadline had technically passed, delivered not through Ilarion directly but through Perrin, whose access to the channel had been quietly, unofficially restored the moment Corvain's emergency transmission reached the tribunal. They stopped, Perrin said, and Sailor heard something in her voice that hadn't been there in days, relief, but also something steadier underneath it. Sailor, they actually stopped. Sailor stood in the hearth hall, surrounded by thousands of people who had just spent 4 hours proving, without meaning to prove anything at all beyond the simple truth of who they already were, that they could not be erased by a filing deadline, and allowed herself, finally, to feel the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay since the 6-hour warning arrived. Tell Administrator Ilarion, she said, that we'd be glad to discuss proper terms, whenever he's ready to treat us like the people we've always been instead of a resource he almost mined by mistake. The formal recognition ceremony took place 3 months later, not in a compact tribunal chamber, but in the hearth hall itself, at Sailor's specific request, because she wanted the record to show that history had been made in the same room where 2,300 ordinary voices had made it happen. Delegate representatives from the compact tribunal attended in person for the first time in the region's history, alongside Administrator Corvain, alongside Jos Ilarion, who arrived, to everyone's mild surprise, not as an adversary, but as a witness who had specifically requested to see the place his own assumptions had so thoroughly underestimated. I've spent a career treating unregistered populations as edge cases in a resource ledger, Ilarion said during his brief remarks, delivered with the particular discomfort of a man revising a lifetime's professional certainty in public. I want to be honest about what happened here. I assumed slowness was simply what large groups of people were. Aldous Reach taught me that assumption was never a law of nature. It was just a habit nobody had tested properly. I don't know how to fully apologize for how close that habit came to costing you everything. I can only promise to carry the lesson forward. The tribunal's ruling, read aloud by its senior delegate, granted Aldous Reach full sovereign recognition under compact law, permanent removal from the abandonment ledger, and formal acknowledgement of the naming circle as a legitimate governing structure, the first population-wide consensus system of its kind to receive such recognition. Ozenmar, the old keeper, who had pressed a data stylus into Sailor's hand on the night the drilling rigs first arrived, sat near the front of the gathered crowd for the ruling, and when the senior delegate finished speaking, she leaned over to Sailor and said, quietly enough that only Sailor heard it, "Your grandmother would have liked knowing it only took 4 hours in the end. She always said we were faster than we gave ourselves credit for." She usually was right about that sort of thing, Sailor said. She usually was right about most things, Ozen agreed, and went back to listening, satisfied, as the tribunal moved on to the formal terms of recognition. Sailor, standing at the center of the hearth hall in the same spot where she'd once taught 17 children the names of 11 founders, found herself unexpectedly without words when the moment came for her own remarks. And so she did the only thing that felt honest. She turned to the crowd, the way she always had, and let them answer instead of speaking for them. "Say it back to me," she said, and the entire cavern, thousands of voices at once, rose into the counting song, the same 11 notes that had once carried a young colony's grief now carrying something else entirely, pride, memory, and the simple, steady fact of having endured. Perendal stood near the entrance where she'd first watched a circle session unfold months earlier, her ethics review quietly closed with a formal commendation instead of a reprimand, and found herself humming the notes without meaning to, the way she had since her very first week among them. Administrator Corvain, standing beside her, watched the crowd's voices rise together and said, mostly to himself, 190 years. And nobody outside these tunnels ever knew what they'd built. They knew, Perrin said. They just never needed anyone else to notice before now. Later that evening, back aboard the Renlight, a junior technician flagged a routine signal sweep for Perrin's attention, the same 11-note pattern that had first crossed her console all those months ago, still looping faintly from the surface, no longer hidden, no longer unlicensed, broadcast now on an open frequency for anyone in the region who cared to listen. The technician asked her, not unreasonably, what the strange little song actually meant. Perrin thought about Iris Amel's last written words, about 190 years of names spoken so they would never simply vanish into silence, and about a room full of ordinary people who had turned 4 hours and one impossible deadline into the fastest act of collective will the Compact had ever recorded. It means they are still counting, she said. And now everyone finally knows why.